He was 53 years old, and nobody knew his name. Every night, he pushed his mop across marble floors that cost more than everything he owned. He cleaned bathrooms used by people who never looked at him. He emptied trash cans filled with coffee cups and crumpled sheet music. He wiped down mirrors in hallways where young musicians rushed past him like he was part of the furniture. For 11 years, this had been his life. 11 years at one of the most famous music schools in America. 11 years walking past grand pianos that gleamed under soft lights. 11 years listening to the sounds of violins and cellos and voices floating through practice room doors. And in all that time, not a single person had asked him his last name. He understood why. He was the janitor, the cleaning guy, the man in the faded blue uniform who showed up when everyone else went home. His job was to be invisible, and he had become very good at it. He knew how to move through a room without being noticed. He knew how to keep his eyes down and his voice quiet. He had learned, over many years, how to take up as little space as possible in a world that didn't seem to have room for him. But here is the thing about invisible people. Just because no one sees them doesn't mean they have nothing to show. He had a secret. A secret he had carried for so long that sometimes he wondered if it was even real anymore. Sometimes, late at night when the hallways were empty and the only sound was the hum of the heating system, he would stop outside one of the practice rooms. He would stand there in the darkness, looking through the small window at the piano inside, and his hands would start to shake. Not from cold, not from age, from memory. Because once, a very long time ago, he had been a boy who could make a piano sing. It started when he was 7 years old. His family lived in a small apartment in one of the roughest neighborhoods in Chicago. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. His father was there sometimes, gone most of the time, and eventually gone for good. They didn't have much. Some weeks, they didn't have enough. But one evening, his mother came home with something unexpected. She had found it sitting next to a dumpster behind the church where she cleaned floors on weekends. It was a keyboard. Old. Broken. Missing 3 keys. The kind of thing most people would walk right past. But she carried it home anyway. All the way across town, on the bus. Because she had seen something in her son. She had noticed how he would stop and stare whenever they passed a music store. How his fingers would tap out rhythms on the kitchen table. How he would hum songs he had only heard once and remember every note perfectly. She couldn't give him lessons. She couldn't afford a real piano. But she could give him this broken keyboard and hope it would be enough. It was more than enough. Within a week, he had figured out how to play simple melodies. Within a month, he was picking out songs from the radio. Within a year, he was creating his own music, filling their tiny apartment with sounds that made his mother stop whatever she was doing and just listen. He had no formal training, no teacher, no books. He learned everything by ear, by instinct, by some mysterious gift that lived in his fingers and his heart. He would hear a song once and then sit down and play it back perfectly. He would wake up in the middle of the night with a melody in his head and rush to the keyboard to capture it before it disappeared. By the time he was 12, he could play anything. Classical pieces he heard on the old radio. Jazz standards from the club down the street. Gospel songs from Sunday morning services. His fingers moved across the keys like they had been doing it for centuries. Like the music had always been there inside him, just waiting to come out. A teacher at his school heard him playing one afternoon. She had walked past the music room and stopped dead in her tracks, certain she was hearing a recording. When she opened the door and saw a skinny 12-year-old boy sitting at the old-school piano, she almost didn't believe it. She arranged for him to audition at a special program for gifted young musicians. He played a piece he had written himself, something slow and sad and beautiful that he called a song for his mother. When he finished, one of the judges was wiping her eyes. Another one leaned over to his colleague and whispered something. Later, the teacher told him what the judge had said. That boy has a gift that comes along once in a generation. Do not let him slip through the cracks. But sometimes, Even when people try their hardest, the cracks are too wide. He was 15 when his mother got sick. The doctors used words he didn't understand, but he understood the fear in her eyes. He understood the bills that started piling up on the kitchen counter. He understood that she could no longer work her 2 jobs, could barely get out of bed some days. So he made a choice. The only choice he felt he could make. He dropped out of school. He lied about his age and got a job at a warehouse across town. He worked the night shift, hauling boxes until his arms ached and his back screamed. He came home in the morning, made his mother breakfast, made sure she took her medicine, and then slept for a few hours before doing it all over again. The keyboard sat in the corner of his room, gathering dust. At first, he told himself it was temporary. Just until his mother got better. Just until things settled down. He would go back to school. He would play again. He would become the musician everyone said he could be. But his mother didn't get better. And things didn't settle down. And the weeks turned into months. And the months turned into years. And somewhere along the way, he stopped telling himself it was temporary. He stopped playing altogether. It was too painful. Every time he looked at those keys, he thought about everything he had given up. Every time he heard music, something inside him twisted and ached. So he packed the keyboard away. He pushed the music deep down where he didn't have to feel it. He taught himself to walk past pianos without looking at them, to hear beautiful melodies without letting them touch him. He got good at it. He got so good at it that after a while, he almost forgot he had ever played at all. Almost. His mother passed away when he was 23. She went quietly, in her sleep, in the same apartment where she had given him that broken keyboard. He sat beside her bed for a long time after she was gone, holding her hand, remembering all the times she had stopped to listen when he played. At the funeral, someone asked if he wanted to play something. A hymn, a song she had loved. Anything. He said no. He couldn't explain why. He just knew that if he touched a piano now, after all this time, something inside him would break open and never close again. So he didn't touch one. Not that day. Not the next year. Not the next decade. 37 years passed. 37 years of different jobs, different cities, different chapters of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He worked in factories and warehouses and restaurants and office buildings. He married once, briefly, to a kind woman who eventually left because she said she couldn't reach him, couldn't find whatever part of him he had locked away. And then, at 42 years old, he applied for a janitorial position at a music conservatory in Chicago. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he wanted to be close to music again, even if he couldn't make it himself. Maybe he thought he could handle it now, after all this time. Maybe he just needed a job, and this was the one that called him back. For 11 years, he proved himself right. He could handle it. He could walk past those pianos every night without stopping. He could hear those students playing without falling apart. He had made peace with who he was now. A janitor. An invisible man. Someone whose gift had died a long time ago, and was never coming back. That was what he believed. Until the night of the Winter Gala, when everything changed. The Winter Gala was the biggest night of the year at the conservatory. Every December, the school transformed into something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, white flowers decorated every table. Men in expensive suits and women in elegant gowns filled the grand hall, holding champagne glasses and laughing at jokes that probably weren't that funny. This was the night when the wealthy people came. The donors. The board members. The kind of people who wrote checks with more zeros than he would ever see in his bank account. They came to feel good about themselves, to support the arts, to watch talented young students perform, and then tell everyone at their next dinner party about it. He had worked the gala every year for the past 11 years. His job was simple. Stay out of sight. Clear the plates when people were done eating. Empty the trash bins before they got too full. Wipe up any spills quickly and quietly. Be invisible, the way he always was. He was good at this job. He knew how to move through a crowd without bumping into anyone. He knew how to keep his head down, so no one felt uncomfortable making eye contact with the help. He knew exactly when to step forward and when to disappear into the background. But this year, something felt different. He couldn't explain it. From the moment he arrived at work that evening, there was a strange feeling in his chest. A restlessness. An ache that he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was the weather. Ache. December had turned bitterly cold. The kind of cold that makes you think about your life and wonder if this is really all there is. Or maybe it was the piano. It sat on the main stage at the front of the grand hall. A Steinway grand, worth more than most people's houses. It was polished to perfection, gleaming black under the soft golden lights. A small velvet rope surrounded it, keeping it separate from everything else, like a king on a throne. All night, he found himself looking at it. Every time he passed through the hall, with a tray of dirty glasses, his eyes drifted to that stage. Every time he pushed his cart toward the kitchen, he slowed down just a little, just to look at those keys. He had seen this piano 1,000 times before. He had cleaned around it, dusted near it, mopped the floor beneath the stage where it sat. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, it was calling to him. That's a crazy thing to say. He knew that. A piano doesn't call to anyone. It's just wood, and strings, and hammers. It doesn't know who is looking at it. It doesn't care. But tell that to the boy who used to play for hours on a broken keyboard in a tiny apartment. Tell that to the teenager who could make grown women cry with songs he wrote himself. Tell that to the man who had spent 37 years running from the music inside him. Tonight, the piano was calling. And he was getting tired of running. The evening went on. Students performed beautiful pieces. Donors applauded politely. Speeches were made about the importance of music education and the bright future of the next generation. He stood in the shadows near the kitchen door, watching it all, feeling more invisible than ever. Around 9 o'clock, there was a break in the program. The stage was empty. The guests were mingling, refreshing their drinks, chatting in small groups. The piano sat alone, under the lights, waiting. He didn't make a decision. That's the honest truth. He didn't think about what he was doing, or what might happen. His feet simply started moving, carrying him across the hall, past the round tables with their white tablecloths, past the wealthy guests in their expensive clothes, toward the stage. He climbed the 3 small steps. He stepped over the velvet rope, and then he was standing in front of the piano, close enough to touch it. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His hands were trembling at his sides. He hadn't been this close to a piano in decades. He had forgotten how beautiful they were, how the keys seemed to glow, how the wood smelled like possibility. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and touched a single key. Just one. A soft note rang out and then faded into silence. And in that moment, something inside him cracked open. Before he could stop himself, he sat down on the bench. It happened so fast, like his body was moving on its own, like some part of him that had been sleeping for 37 years had suddenly woken up and taken control. He didn't notice the woman approaching until her voice cut through the air like a slap. "Excuse me. What exactly do you think you're doing?" He looked up. She was standing at the edge of the stage, staring at him with cold eyes. She was the director of the conservatory, a tall woman with silver hair pulled back tight and a string of pearls around her neck. He had seen her many times over the years, walking through the halls like she owned them, which in a way she did. She had never once looked at him before tonight. Now she was looking. And she was not happy. "Sir, I need you to step away from that instrument immediately." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Behind the director, a crowd was gathering. Students in formal wear, donors with curious expressions, staff members whispering to each other, all of them staring at the janitor who had wandered onto the stage like he belonged there. His voice came out rough, barely a whisper. "I just wanted to play something. Just one song. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not kind laughter. The kind of laughter that says, "Who does this guy think he is?" The kind of laughter he had heard his whole life, every time he dared to want something more than what the world had decided he deserved. A young woman near the front, a violin student with perfect posture and an expensive dress, leaned over to her friend and whispered something. They both giggled. An older man in a gray suit shook his head with a pitying smile, the way you might smile at a child who says they want to fly to the moon. The director's expression hardened. She pulled out her phone. "Sir, this piano costs more than you will make in the next 10 years. If you don't step away right now, I'm calling security." He should have left. Every logical part of his brain was screaming at him to apologize, to get off that stage, to go back to being invisible before this got any worse. He could be escorted out in front of everyone, humiliated in a way he might never recover from. But something held him there. Something stronger than fear, stronger than logic, stronger than 37 years of staying quiet and staying small. Maybe it was the memory of his mother, carrying that broken keyboard home on the bus because she believed in him. Maybe it was the voice of that teacher, saying he had a gift that comes along once in a generation. Maybe it was just the simple fact that he was 53 years old, and he was so tired of being invisible, so tired of wondering what might have been. He looked at the director. He looked at the crowd of wealthy strangers with their champagne and their judgment. He looked at the young students who had been given every opportunity he had been denied. And then he spoke, quietly, but clearly. "One song, please. That's all I'm asking. Just let me play one song." More laughter. Someone in the back said something he couldn't quite hear, but the tone was mocking. The director's finger hovered over her phone, ready to make the call. Then an older gentleman stepped forward. He had white hair and expensive glasses, and the confident posture of a man who was used to being listened to. He was one of the biggest donors, someone important, someone whose opinion mattered. He looked at the janitor on the stage. He looked at the director. And then he smiled. A smile that wasn't kind at all. "Oh, let him play," the old man said, waving his hand dismissively. "This should be entertaining." The crowd laughed again. A few people pulled out their phones, ready to record what they assumed would be a disaster, ready to capture the embarrassing moment when a janitor tried to play a piano and failed miserably. The director hesitated, then stepped back. Her expression made it clear that she expected this to be over quickly, that this foolish man would plunk out a few bad notes, realize his mistake, and slink away in shame. He turned back to the piano. The keys stretched out before him, black and white, waiting. 37 years. That's how long it had been since he had played. His left hand had arthritis now. His fingers were stiff from years of hard work. He wasn't a prodigy anymore. He was just an old janitor who had made the mistake of thinking he still had something left to give. But his hands found their position anyway. Muscle memory, buried deep beneath decades of silence. He closed his eyes, and he began to play. The first notes were uncertain, hesitant, like a man taking his first steps after being bedridden for years. His fingers pressed down on the keys, and the sound that came out was soft, almost fragile, like it might break if anyone breathed too loudly. In the crowd, someone snickered. A woman whispered to her husband. The old donor who had told him to play was already smiling, ready to enjoy the show, ready to have a funny story to tell at his next dinner party about the janitor who thought he could play piano. But then, something happened. His fingers found the next note. And the next. And suddenly, they weren't hesitant anymore. They were searching, remembering, reaching back through 37 years of silence to find something that had never really left. The melody began to take shape. It was a piece he had written himself, a long time ago, in a tiny apartment on the south side of Chicago. He had been 15 years old. His mother was already getting sick, though neither of them knew how bad it would get. He had sat at his broken keyboard late one night, unable to sleep, and this song had poured out of him like water from a broken dam. He had called it a song for the forgotten, For all the people who work hard and dream big and never get their chance. For all the invisible ones who slip through the cracks while the world looks the other way. He hadn't played it in 37 years. He wasn't even sure he remembered it, but his hands remembered. His heart remembered. And as the melody grew stronger, something inside him began to wake up. The music started soft and sad, like rain falling on an empty street. Single notes hung in the air, lonely and beautiful, telling the story of a boy who had a gift he couldn't keep. Then the melody began to build, layer upon layer, the left hand joining in with deep, rich chords that seemed to come from somewhere far below the surface. The snickering stopped. The whispers died away. One by one, the phones that had been raised to record his failure slowly lowered. Because this wasn't failure. This wasn't some foolish old man embarrassing himself in front of his betters. This was something else entirely. Something none of them had expected. Something that made them forget about their champagne and their expensive clothes and their carefully planned evening. The music filled the grand hall, reaching into every corner, wrapping around every person like a warm blanket. It spoke of things that words could never capture. Loss, longing, the ache of dreams that got buried under the weight of real life, the sorrow of watching the years slip by and wondering if it's too late, if it was always too late, if some doors close forever and never open again. But there was something else in the music too. Hope. Faint at first. Just a glimmer. Like the first light of dawn on the darkest night. The melody climbed higher. The tempo quickened. And that glimmer of hope grew brighter and brighter until it was impossible to ignore. The song was telling a story. His story. The story of a boy who loved music more than anything, who had to choose between his dreams and his family, and chose his family without hesitation because that's what love does. Who spent decades pushing down the thing that made him special because he didn't have the luxury of being special. Who learned to be invisible because being seen was too painful. But also the story of a man who never quite gave up, who took a job at a music school even though it broke his heart a little every day, who stood outside practice room doors in the darkness, listening, remembering, keeping a tiny flame alive, even when he thought it had gone out forever. The music swelled to a crescendo, powerful and overwhelming, every note ringing with emotion so raw that it was almost too much to bear. His fingers flew across the keys with a skill that seemed impossible for someone who hadn't played in decades. But that's the thing about gifts like his. They don't disappear. They just wait. They wait in the muscles and the bones and the deepest parts of the soul, and when the moment finally comes, they rise up like they never left. And then, slowly, gently, the music began to fade. The storm of sound softened into something tender and quiet. The final notes fell like tears, one after another, until there was only silence. He kept his eyes closed. He was afraid to open them, afraid that when he did, he would see what he expected to see. Mocking faces, rolled eyes, people already turning away, unimpressed, ready to get back to their fancy party and forget about the janitor who had interrupted their evening. The silence stretched on. 1 second, 2. He couldn't hear anything. Not a cough, not a whisper, not a single sound. Slowly, he opened his eyes. The director was standing exactly where she had been before, at the edge of the stage, but she wasn't reaching for her phone anymore. She wasn't looking at him with cold, dismissive eyes. She was crying. Tears were running down her cheeks, and she wasn't even trying to hide them. Her hand was pressed against her chest, like she was trying to hold her heart together. Behind her, the crowd was frozen. The old donor who had expected entertainment had taken off his glasses and was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. The young violin student who had giggled at him was openly weeping, her perfect makeup ruined, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Everywhere he looked, he saw the same thing. Tears, shock, faces completely transformed by what they had just witnessed. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, someone started to clap. It was slow at first. Just one person, bringing their hands together with a sound that echoed through the silent hall. Then another person joined in, and another, and suddenly the applause was spreading like wildfire, growing louder and louder until it was thunderous, until the crystal chandeliers were trembling overhead and the walls themselves seemed to shake. People were standing up, rising from their seats at the fancy round tables, knocking over champagne glasses, not caring about the spills on their expensive clothes. They were cheering. They were shouting. Someone yelled bravo, and the word was picked up and repeated until it became a chant. He sat there on the piano bench, completely overwhelmed. He didn't understand what was happening. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was a janitor, an invisible man. He had spent decades believing that his gift was dead, that he had killed it through neglect, that it was too late for someone like him. But here were all these people. These wealthy, important, powerful people, standing and wearing and applauding like he was something special, like he mattered, like the music he had kept buried inside him for 37 years was worth hearing after all. The applause went on and on. It seemed like it would never stop. His eyes were blurring now, and he realized that he was crying too. The tears were falling onto the piano keys, onto his worn janitor's uniform, and he didn't try to stop them. Finally, the director stepped forward. She climbed the stairs to the stage, her legs unsteady, her face still wet with tears. She walked toward him slowly, like she was approaching something sacred. When she reached the piano bench, she stopped. For a long moment, she just looked at him, really looked at him. Maybe for the first time in 11 years. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, broken. "Who are you?" she asked. "Who are you really?" He looked at her. He looked at the crowd of people still on their feet, still applauding, still crying. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had remembered what his mind had tried to forget. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel invisible. He took a breath, and he began to tell his story. The applause had finally faded, but nobody had gone back to their seats. Nobody was thinking about champagne or small talk or the rest of the evening's program. Every person in that grand hall was gathered around the stage, looking up at the man in the faded blue janitor uniform, waiting to hear him speak. He had never told this story to anyone. Not completely. Bits and pieces, maybe, over the years. A few words here and there to coworkers who asked where he learned to hum like that. A vague mention to his ex-wife about playing piano as a kid. But the full story, from beginning to end, with all the pain, and all the sacrifice, and all the years of silence, he had kept that locked away so deep that sometimes he forgot it was there. But now, sitting on that piano bench with tears still drying on his cheeks, he found himself talking. And once he started, he couldn't stop. He told them about growing up poor, about the apartment with the leaky ceiling, and the neighbors who fought through the walls, and the nights when dinner was just bread and whatever else his mother could stretch until payday. He told them about his father leaving and never coming back, about learning early that some people just disappear and there's nothing you can do about it. He told them about the keyboard, the broken, dusty keyboard that his mother found next to a dumpster and carried home on the bus because she believed her son had something special inside him. He told them how he taught himself to play, how the music came out of him like it had been waiting his whole life for a way to escape. He told them about the teacher who heard him play and said he had a gift that comes along once in a generation. About the audition where he made judges cry. About all the dreams he had of concert halls and standing ovations and a life filled with the music he loved. And then he told them about his mother getting sick. His voice cracked when he got to this part. The crowd was completely silent. A woman in the front row had her hand over her mouth. The old donor who had wanted entertainment was staring at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. He told them about the choice he made at 15 years old, how it wasn't really a choice at all, because when someone you love needs you, you don't think about yourself. You don't think about your dreams or your future or the gift that everyone says you have. You just do what needs to be done. He told them about dropping out of school, about the warehouse job and the night shifts, and the exhaustion that seeped into his bones and never really left, about coming home every morning to make breakfast for his mother, to help her take her medicine, to pretend that everything was going to be okay, even when they both knew it probably wasn't. He told them about packing away the keyboard, about how it hurt too much to look at it, too much to hear music, too much to be reminded of everything he was losing, about teaching himself to walk past pianos like they were invisible, the same way he was learning to be invisible himself. He told them about his mother dying, about sitting beside her bed and holding her hand and knowing that she had given him everything she had and wishing he could have given her more, wishing he could have become the musician she believed he could be. By now, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The director was crying again. Young students who had spent their whole lives surrounded by music and opportunity and support were weeping for a man who had none of those things and had to give up his dream anyway. He told them about the years that followed. The different jobs, the different cities, the marriage that didn't last because he had locked away too much of himself to let anyone in, about feeling like a ghost, moving through the world without leaving any mark, watching other people live the life he might have had. And then he told them why he took this job, why, at 42 years old, he applied to be a janitor at a music school when he could have worked anywhere else. He told them the truth, which he had never admitted even to himself until this very moment. He wanted to be close to the music, even if he couldn't play it, even if it hurt to hear it every single day. He wanted to be near the pianos, near the practice rooms, near the students who were living the dream he had to abandon. Because being close to music, even as a janitor, was better than being far from it. Because some part of him had never stopped loving it, had never stopped hoping, had never completely let go. When he finished talking, the silence was absolute. Nobody knew what to say. What do you say to a story like that? What words are enough? The director spoke first. Her voice was thick with emotion, barely steady. She said she had walked past him 1,000 times and never once wondered who he was or where he came from. She said she was ashamed of that. She said she was ashamed of how she had spoken to him tonight, of the way she had treated him like he didn't belong on that stage. She said she was sorry. And she meant it. He could see it in her eyes. Then the old donor stepped forward. His whole demeanor had changed. The arrogance was gone. The superior smile had disappeared. He looked humbled in a way that maybe he hadn't been humbled in a very long time. He introduced himself. He said he had spent 50 years in the music industry, discovering talent, building careers, helping artists reach audiences around the world. He said he had heard thousands of musicians in his lifetime, some famous, some forgotten. And he said that what he had just heard, what this man in a janitor's uniform had just played on that piano, was one of the most extraordinary things he had ever witnessed. The crowd murmured in agreement. People were nodding, wiping their eyes, looking at the janitor like they were seeing him for the first time. Because they were. For 11 years, he had been invisible to them. Just part of the background. Just someone who cleaned up their messes and stayed out of their way. But now they saw him. They really saw him. A young piano student approached the stage. She was maybe 19 or 20, with the kind of confidence that comes from growing up with lessons and recitals and teachers who nurtured her talent every step of the way. She had tears on her cheeks and something like wonder in her eyes. She asked him what that piece was called, the one he had just played. She said she had never heard anything like it, and she had heard a lot of music. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her. He said he had written it when he was 15 years old, sitting at a broken keyboard in a cramped apartment while his mother slept in the next room. He had called it a song for the forgotten. The young woman nodded slowly. She said it was beautiful. She said it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. And then, she said something that broke him open all over again. She asked if he would teach it to her. He stared at her. This talented young woman, with her whole future ahead of her, with every opportunity he had been denied, was asking him to teach her something. Like he had something worth sharing. Like his music mattered. He didn't know what to say. He had spent so long believing it was too late, that his gift was wasted, that the world had moved on without him, and there was no way back. But here was this young woman, looking at him with respect and admiration. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe it was never too late. Maybe the music he had buried for 37 years had been waiting for this moment all along. He looked at the piano. He looked at the crowd. He looked at all these people who had finally seen him. And for the first time in his life, he started to believe that his story wasn't over yet. The video went everywhere. By the next morning, it had been shared thousands of times. By the end of the week, millions of people around the world had watched a janitor in a faded blue uniform sit down at a grand piano and make an entire room cry. The headlines wrote themselves. News channels picked up the story. Talk shows called. Newspapers and magazines wanted interviews. Overnight, the invisible man had become someone the whole world wanted to see. He didn't know how to handle any of it. For 53 years, he had lived a quiet life. A small life. Some might say. He went to work, he came home, he watched television, he went to sleep. Nobody knew his name, and that had been fine with him. Safe, even. Being invisible meant nobody could hurt you. Nobody could let you down. But now, his face was everywhere. Strangers recognized him on the street. People stopped him in the grocery store to shake his hand and tell him they cried watching his video. His phone, which used to ring maybe once a week, wouldn't stop buzzing with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. It was overwhelming. There were moments when he wanted to run away from all of it, to go back to being invisible, to pretend that night at the gala had never happened. That would be easier. Safer. He knew how to be invisible. He didn't know how to be this, but then he would remember the feeling of his fingers on those keys. The music pouring out of him after 37 years of silence. The faces in the crowd, transformed by something he had created, and he knew he couldn't go back. Not now. Not after finally being seen. The old donor was true to his word. He called 3 days after the gala and asked to meet for coffee. They sat in a quiet corner of a small cafe, and the old man laid out his plan. He had connections in the music industry. He had money. He had the ability to open doors that had been closed to the janitor his entire life. He wanted to help him record an album. Real studio time. Professional equipment. Proper distribution. He wanted to give him the chance he never got. The janitor listened to all of it with a strange feeling in his chest. Part of him wanted to say yes immediately. This was everything he had ever dreamed of. Everything he had given up when he was 15 years old. But another part of him was scared. What if it was too late? What if his hands were too old, his skills too rusty? What if the world only cared because of the story, not the music? He told the old man he needed time to think. The old man nodded and said he understood. "Take all the time you need," he said. "But don't take too long. Life is shorter than we think." The janitor went home that night and sat in his small apartment, staring at the wall. He thought about his mother, about the broken keyboard, about all the years he had spent running from who he really was. He thought about the choice he had made at 15, and he realized something he had never let himself see before. He had spent his whole life feeling like he gave up his dream, like he sacrificed his gift on the altar of responsibility, and it was gone forever. But that wasn't true. The music had never left him. It had been there all along, waiting in his fingers, waiting in his heart. Waiting for the moment when he was finally ready to let it out again. He called the old man the next day and said yes. The recording sessions were harder than he expected. His hands cramped up sometimes. His arthritis made certain movements painful. There were days when he couldn't get through a piece without stopping, when the frustration built up so high he wanted to quit. But he didn't quit. He showed up every day. He worked through the pain. He played the same passages over and over, until his fingers remembered them perfectly. And slowly, piece by piece, the album came together. He recorded the song he had played at the gala, the song for the forgotten. But he also wrote new music, songs about his mother, about the apartment where he grew up, about the long years of silence and the hope that never quite died. Each piece was a chapter of his story, translated into melody and harmony and rhythm. When the album was finished, they released it without much fanfare. No big marketing campaign, no celebrity endorsements, just the music and the story behind it. It debuted at #1 on the classical charts. Critics called it a masterpiece. They used words like profound and transcendent, and once in a generation, the same words that Teacher had used 40 years ago. Except this time, the whole world was listening. But the success of the album wasn't what mattered most to him. What mattered was the letter he received from a 16-year-old boy in Detroit. The boy wrote that he was a musician, too. Piano. Just like the janitor. He had been planning to drop out of school to help support his family, just like the janitor had done. He had been ready to give up on his dreams because life was too hard and dreams were too expensive. But then he heard the janitor's story. He listened to the album. He watched the video of that night at the gala, over and over again. And he decided to stay in school, to keep playing, to hold on to his dream a little longer. The letter said, "Thank you. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late. Thank you for reminding me that gifts don't disappear just because we can't use them for a while. Thank you for being proof that invisible people can be seen, if they just have the courage to step into the light." He read that letter at his kitchen table, and he cried harder than he had cried in years. Because he realized something that changed everything. All those years he spent being invisible, they weren't wasted. All that pain and sacrifice and silence, it wasn't for nothing. Because if he had become a famous musician at 15, he would never have been that janitor at the gala. He would never have been the underdog who surprised everyone. He would never have been living proof that it's never too late. That dreams can survive decades of neglect. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things. His story mattered because of the hard parts, not in spite of them. He framed that letter and hung it above his piano. Every day, he looked at it and remembered why he kept playing. Not for fame, not for money, but for every invisible person out there who was starting to believe their dreams were dead. He played for them. He never worked as a janitor again. But every year, on the anniversary of that winter gala, he went back to the conservatory. Not to perform, not to be celebrated. He went back to find the people no one else saw. The cleaning staff, the cafeteria workers, the security guards, the invisible ones. He would find them in the hallways or the break rooms, and he would sit down with them, and he would ask a simple question. "Do you have a dream you gave up on?" And then he would listen. Really listen. The way no one had ever listened to him. Some of them laughed and said no. Some of them shrugged and changed the subject. But some of them got quiet. Some of them got tears in their eyes. And some of them told him stories that broke his heart and filled it up at the same time. He couldn't help all of them. He knew that. He couldn't give everyone a second chance the way he had been given one. But he could see them. He could hear them. He could let them know that someone in this world knew they existed and thought they mattered. And sometimes, that's enough. Sometimes, being seen is all it takes. He was 53 years old when he touched that piano at the gala. He was 53 years old when his life changed forever. Some people might say, that's too old, that your best years are behind you by then. That dreams have expiration dates, and his had passed a long time ago. But he knew better now. He knew that gifts don't die just because we stop using them. He knew that courage doesn't have an age limit. He knew that the world is full of invisible people with extraordinary things inside them, just waiting for someone to give them a chance. And he knew that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be.